What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Hang 10. I am your host, meteorologist Brian, Michigan. We're hanging out here in the Wavy Plus studio, of course. Got a fun episode planned for us today. Hopefully, everybody's doing well. It's July 7th, the time that we're filming this episode here. So we've gotten through the craziness of July 4th and all that comes with it. The crowded beaches. Unfortunately, this year, the flat surf, there was really not much surf to go around this 4th of July. I feel like some years we get lucky right around kind of that holiday when everybody's able to take off. We do end up lucking into a swell. Not so much the case this year. We've been a little bit quiet really since the back half of the month of June, thanks to that heat dome that set up. There was just no storms offshore. So we're looking to continue potentially that pattern as we go through maybe portions of July. Hopefully not, fingers crossed, we get some storms offshore to send us some waves. Speaking of storms, we're going to talk about Tropical Storm Shantel. And that made its impact on the southeast coast. And we picked up a little bit of surf here across Hampton Roads. It wasn't great quality-wise, and it certainly wasn't big by any stretch of the imagination, but we got a little bit of something to kind of break the flat spell that we've been kind of going through. It was something for the longboards for sure to make it easy to surf out there. So that was Shantel. We're also going to talk about upwelling because the water temperature has been really warm. With all the heat that we've been dealing with, it's been very warm the past couple of weeks. But this week, with kind of Shantel to our south, we've been getting south and southwesterly winds recently for the past couple of days here. So the water temperature is starting to drop. I was looking at readings just a couple weeks ago. We were into the low 80s, now 70s. So it can drop really quickly with just a little bit of side shore and side offshore wind. So we'll break down upwelling, kind of what it is, and just how cold it can get. It can make the water here in the summertime. You'd think peak summer, it should stay warm. Not always the case. We're also going to bring up East Coast surfing in July. East Coast surfing in July, which is very fickle, very much like the month of June, kind of hard to come by for some swell. So we can first start off by talking about what exactly is upwelling, because it happens, every single summer here. It really happens, obviously every season, but especially it's noticeable, especially in the summertime where the water temperature can change pretty drastically. So essentially, what upwelling is a process where deep and colder water can rise to the surface. And what you need for that is the wind. The wind is super important. It's the main reason for the upwelling. It needs to blow across the surface of the water and push away that warmer surface water away from the coastline or offshore. You can do that by having south winds here in Hampton Roads, side shore winds, or southwesterly winds, which is kind of side offshore. Side shore winds, with kind of the way it moves the water around and creates eddies in the ocean, is a little more effective for upwelling that cooler water from deeper in the ocean and moving that warmer water offshore. You may think it's the other way around where you need directly offshore winds. It still does the same thing. It just takes a little bit longer. A side shore wind like the south or southwest winds here in Virginia Beach or even along the Outer Banks are much more effective in upwelling that water. Now, that warmer water on the surface is going to be much warmer because it's being heated by the sun. And when you don't have much wind around, it can really allow that water temperature to ramp up pretty quick, like we saw in June, where the water temp got to around 80 degrees for a lot of us. We were surfing small waves, mind you, in just board shorts and maybe a t-shirt. Now it's kind of more getting into the spring suit type of deal with kind of the upwelling that we've been seeing. A little bit of a coolness, a chill to the water when you step in. So hopefully it doesn't last for too long. It'll likely, fill back in the warmer water as time goes on. But, every now and then in the summertime, you'll step in and you'll go, whoa, that's a little bit cooler than what I remember the last session. So essentially what's happening here is the cold water from below is replacing the warm surface water. It's kind of a circular system, if you could think of it that way. Water can sometimes go from 80 degrees down to the 60s. So 10 to 20 degree drops is enough to put you from board shorts to a wetsuit session pretty quickly. I remember back in New Jersey, where I grew up, the upwelling happens really, really drastically in our area. We can have 75-degree water temps in July, and it can go down to 50, the upper 50s. So it is extreme, and it can often lead to, people struggling with hypothermia if they don't go to the beach with the correct equipment, and you have no idea. Maybe you didn't check the buoy readings for the latest water temperature. It could catch you totally off guard. So that's something that, as surfers, is something that you kind of have to look for. And if it's not part of your kind of regular day-to-day check, I definitely advise it, because the water temperature can really make a difference. And if you don't have the proper equipment, that can really impact your surf sessions. If you don't have the wetsuit when you need it, not going to really have a good time. You're going to be out of the water before you really know it. So let's talk about also kind of the weather conditions that go into upwelling, because it is pretty specific, especially here across Hampton Roads. A lot of times it happens before low pressure systems move in. You have that center of low pressure that circulates maybe to our north and west. Out ahead of that system, we have southerly winds. We have southwesterly winds even sometimes before the trailing cold front from that storm moves through. So that upwells that cooler water that a lot of times we can almost tell as surfers when a storm is coming, because the water temperature starts to drop a little bit because you have that wind increasing out of the south and southwest. So it really begins with that persistent south and southwest wind, that side to side offshore wind across Hampton Roads, offshore of Virginia Beach, the Outer Banks, Eastern Shore. That warm surface water is going to drift offshore. It's going to drift away from the coastline. So that, remember back these past couple weeks, we've had some water temperatures in the 80s. That is all offshore now with the wind direction that we've been dealt with. That deeper and colder water has been filling in near shore to replace the water that's being, sent out to sea. There has to be an equilibrium with the ocean. So that cooler water is rising up from the depths and replacing that warm water that has been heated kind of by the sun. Now, this is a pretty important process, because what it does is it allows for the cycle of the marine ecosystem to continue. It allows nutrients to kind of fertilize the surface water. And what that does is promotes productivity in an environment. That's super important for the ecosystem. Your phytoplankton, your zooplankton get filtered up to the surface water, and again, helps to kind of fertilize that water. It helps to kind of keep everything going. The plankton are kind of the very basic level of the food chain, essentially. So if the phytoplankton are not in full bloom, then it's going to affect everything else down the line. Everything from small organisms that eat those plankton, to crabs, to fish, then fish to larger creatures, sharks, bigger fish. So it all really trickles down. So that's why upwelling is super, super important. Without this, process, that marine ecosystem would be really disrupted. So again, this is something that needs to happen in nature. And unfortunately, it leads us to some colder water. So make sure you have that wetsuit without holes in it. Make sure you're checking your gear often, taking care of your gear, because whenever this does happen, oftentimes ahead of these storms where the wind goes south and southwest, we're going to be upwelling that cooler water pretty much every single time. And even in the middle of the summer, where the water goes from 80 degrees, it can drop into the 60s pretty quickly. So definitely be mindful of that. Also, little tidbit for the surfers who also fish. I'm sure many people who do fish know this, or at least hardcore fishermen, but good fishing tends to follow these upwelling events. When you kind of bring up the plankton, all these minerals, a lot of times fish and other creatures really like to be around that because of how nutrient rich the water is. A lot of life tends to be hanging around that area. So that's just feeding grounds for these other creatures. So yeah, fishing tends to be good after it. Sometimes the waves too. When you have storms, you have southwest wind kind of bringing in a little bit of swell, you can get some waves too. So it kind of goes hand in hand at every step here. But again, colder water. So that's kind of what we've been dealing with. That process kind of starting this week around the 4th of July. We lucked out with some nice warm water for the 4th of July, but looks like we're cooling off a little bit. So that's been the case. Hey, we're going to take a quick break. Coming up right after the break, we are going to talk about the July and just hurricane season in general, and where we can kind of expect storms to form in the month of July, because that has a lot to do with how active we could be throughout the rest of this month in terms of waves. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. All right, everybody, we're back hanging out in the Wavy Plus studio for another episode of Hang 10, welcome back, everybody. We're going to talk about surfing in July because this is another month where it's pretty slow across the East Coast. It's very similar to June in the fact that we don't have many named storms usually. On average, actually, July gets only one named storm per season. It's a stat I found from the National Hurricane Center. And also, according to NOAA, July accounts for roughly only 7% of Atlantic named storms since 1851. So really throughout our history of gathering data, July is a pretty slow month. And with less activity in the tropics, we're getting less surf out there as well. So it all kind of ties together with the hurricane season, the month of July. Usually it's August that we start to see that activity kind of ramp up. However, I will say July does tend to lean a little bit more favorable than June. It's not by much, but at least it's at least something across the region. So we'll kind of pull up a couple graphics here and break it all down because the water temperature is probably one of the big ones because it really starts to go up across much of the Atlantic basin, even into the Gulf, heading into late June and then throughout July. Our water temperature, which we need for hurricane development, really the minimum is 80 degrees. It needs to be 80 degrees or higher, and especially in the tropical Atlantic basin and also near the shoreline as well, for those storms to form. A lot of times we're kind of in this time of year where at the tail end of fronts we can tend to get development. Now it also, there's a lot of other factors. It's not just the water temperature. How much Saharan dust is being kicked up from Africa and drifting across the ocean to really inhibit things. It kind of puts a lid on our atmosphere in the tropical Atlantic for storm formation. Also, kind of what's the El Nino, La Nina cycle? Right now, we're kind of in this ENSO neutral condition. It's not really leaning warmer than average waters in the equatorial Pacific, but it's not really leaning cooler either. We're kind of in this middle ground. And obviously, if you have El Nino conditions, that typically leads to more shear in the Atlantic basin. La Nina, the opposite. Shear tends to be a little bit reduced. We're kind of in that middle ground. So it's one of those times where it's kind of the day to day. We have to keep checking it, seeing how the shear is, because shear is not good, obviously, for hurricane development. It tends to rip the storm apart. A storm wants to grow tall vertically and be organized in one area for that centralized area of low pressure to form. With a lot of wind shear, you kind of take your storm that's stacked on top of each other and you can kind of rip away the top layer, rip away the middle layer of the storm, and that'll eventually weaken systems. So it's a very delicate balance between, water temperature, the winds aloft, and if you have thunderstorm development as a whole. So there's other factors as well. The ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, that's a zone we watch right along the equator for thunderstorm development. And as we go through the summer, it shifts north. That gives us more showers and thunderstorms to drift into the tropical Atlantic to give us these storms to eventually, ride off into the Atlantic and ride closer to the coastline, tap into some of that warmer water and form. So again, we still kind of look close to home for development. A lot of times it's the tail end of fronts, and I'll kind of bring up this graphic here. This is typical July development zones throughout really our recorded data. This is where the average of most storms form in July. A lot of times it's the north central Gulf or off the southeast coast, which is what we actually had for Shantel. So right off, Georgia, South Carolina, the Florida coastline, that kind of that yellow circle there on the right hand of the graphic, that's where we saw Shantel form. And it's pretty common, again, usually with the tail end of fronts or also with how warm the waters are in the Gulf, assuming that we have the thunderstorm development and less shear, we can usually get stuff going in the Gulf too, just because of how warm it can get so early in the season. A lot of times you also can look for development near the Lesser Antilles. The tropical Atlantic is also warming during this time and likely becoming more active as the intertropical convergence zone shifts its way north. So we're starting to tap into more thunderstorms kind of near Barbados, some of those islands up there east of Puerto Rico. We tend to look out there too. And as they drift through the Caribbean or near the Bahamas, they can usually get their act together, and we hope that something is able to push it offshore. We obviously want these things to ride up the Atlantic coastline, but far enough away so we don't see damage. I say that every week, but it's really important. We don't really want anybody to be affected by this. The further away the storm stays, the better our conditions are going to be for these waves as well. If you have a storm sitting right over top of us, it's going to be way too crazy to surf. It's going to be way too dangerous as well. So there's a kind of a near shore trend when it comes to storm development in the month of July. And on average, again, we usually get only one named storm, so it's not very active, but if they're going to form, it's usually here. I also wanted to pull up this. I did a little bit of digging. Remember, let's see, Hurricane Arthur, 2014. This was actually the only hurricane to make landfall in the continental U.S. on July, well, technically it was July 3rd, I believe. I pulled up some information here. July 3rd in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, kind of near Cape Lookout, Beaufort area, 100-mile-per-hour winds. It was a Category 2 at landfall. You can kind of see the orange kind of bar there, the line, that indicating the Category 2 strength of the system. The peak surge, some areas of the Outer Banks got good surge out of this, 3 to 5 feet above normally dry ground along the Outer Banks, especially kind of near the Oregon Inlet, where the storm surge rose to around 5 feet. So this is a pretty impactful system, obviously cut right through portions of our area here in Hampton Roads along the Outer Banks, but it did kick up some pretty good surf for the mid-Atlantic and off into the Northeast as well. I remember for this storm specifically, this was one of the biggest swells I've ever surfed in the month of July. I was in New Jersey surfing a spot, Bradley Beach in New Jersey. And this was a pretty big one for us. I was around 13 years old, and I started surfing at age 10. I boogie boarded before that, but this was one of the bigger swells I had gotten like since starting surfing. And I remember surfing, it was a 6'6" fun shaped surfboard. So by no means at all is this a surfboard that is really meant for really big waves. For big wave charging. This is more of a board for learning how to ride your shortboard, learning how to kind of carve down the line and kind of get used to having your feet on a hard surfboard, a fiberglass surfboard, because before this I was learning on a foam board. So this was a surfboard that isn't meant to, get into some big waves. I remember going throughout the day, the swell, a lot of times on the East Coast, the swell can build pretty quickly, especially for hurricanes that come really close to the shore. If you could see here with the graphic, Arthur, it even after going offshore of the Outer Banks, it was pretty close to the coastline for at least the eastern shore to Delaware, into the Outer Banks, and New Jersey, and even into Long Island. So this swell came up really, really quickly. I remember at one point in the morning hours, it was probably around head high, let's say, maybe, head high on me. So back then I wasn't as tall as I was now. So maybe, 5 foot on the face of the wave. As the day went on, it built pretty quickly too. So we were out there, me and a couple friends, and it got to the point where, we were pushing 6 to 8 feet, and we were way outside of our comfort zone at that point. But at the same time, it was in the middle of the summer. We didn't have much upwelling before this storm happened. So it was actually a pretty warm surf session. So it was very inviting. The sun was out, clouds were offshore from the storm passing by, but it was very inviting, and the waves are clean. It was offshore wind. So all the ingredients coming together for a good surf session. But while we were out there, it started to build. Each set got a little bit bigger. It went from really head high to double overhead really quickly. And I remember specifically, I still remember to this day, there was a set in particular that really was a standout. I swear to everybody to this day that the swell that me and my friends surfed that day, the set that made us get out of the water was easily a 10-foot set. So it was pretty gnarly. It was pretty radical. It was just a wall of water. You would go over this one wave and you think, oh, that was a really big one. Hopefully nothing's big behind that. And then all of a sudden on the horizon, you just see from, horizon, up and down the coast, north and south in New Jersey, it is just this wall of water, and it's just building and building and building and getting dark as it starts to lurch up from the depths of the ocean. And I remember scratching for the horizon to try and get over this thing. I was terrified. and eventually got over it, just barely. A couple of my buddies didn't get so lucky. They said it was some of the worst, wipeouts they've ever had, just getting ragdolled into the beach. So that's kind of my story of, surfing in July, Hurricane Arthur. A lot of people think of small waves in July, which I do think of that, but also I think of Hurricane Arthur and kind of the scare that I got from that day. That was one of the first times I've ever been met face to face with the raw power of the ocean. So I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that, especially during the peak of hurricane season. But for me, this was in July. This is when, it's fun. Waves are usually small. You don't expect that really to happen. And then boom, one storm tracks close to the coastline, and it can get big pretty quickly. So that's my kind of cool July surfing story. So overall, we're going to hope that the activity kind of ramps up offshore for some waves in the month of July. Again, it's going to be another slow one, most likely, just how climatology is on the East Coast. But August is right around the corner, in September. So we're going to get there eventually for our next swell. Just hanging in there, everybody. Speaking of storms in July, we, of course, had Tropical Storm Shantel move up the coast, made landfall near the Myrtle Beach area of South Carolina. So that happened just the other day, just actually the 6th of July, early in the morning. So it just happened, moving up the coastline, and it gave us a little bit of south swell. It didn't fill in a whole lot because the Outer Banks kind of blocks us from getting the bulk of that swell since this storm was so far south. But nevertheless, it broke the flat spell at least a little bit. So coming up after the break, we got a little bit of clips to show you from surfing Tropical Storm Shantel in Virginia Beach. Hope you'll stick with me here. And we'll close out this episode strong and hope for some more waves in the future. So stick around. We'll be right back. All right, everybody, we are back to another episode of Hang 10. We are going to show some clips of Tropical Storm Shantel and the waves that it sent to Virginia Beach. Onshore winds, so it was choppy, and we were getting blocked by the Outer Banks from the bulk of this swell, the swell direction being pretty much due south. So Hatteras area kind of sticks out a little far, catches a lot of that swell. So unfortunately, we didn't get, as big as it could really get for, a weak tropical storm in July, but we did get a little bit, and it broke the flat spell, as I've been mentioning. So I got some video here that I hope you guys enjoy, and yeah, so hopefully we get some more swell in the future. If you guys get any video, make sure to tag me on Instagram at Brian_Michigan. I'd love to see what everybody's up to around Hampton Roads surfing. Yeah, really fun stuff. So enjoy the video, and we'll be back next week on Monday, 9 p.m. with another episode of Hang 10. All right, what's going on, everybody? We made it to the beach, Virginia Beach, the First Street Jetty, for a couple waves from Tropical Storm Shantel. Now, I know before anybody asks, yes, I am wearing a hoodie in the middle of July. It's pretty windy out at the beach, so wanted to be comfortable. Got the foam board with me, longboard, because the waves aren't too big with this storm. The Outer Banks is kind of sheltering us from a good amount of the swell from Shantel, so waves aren't as big as they could be during tropical systems, but we'll take it nonetheless. Yeah, it should be fun. I'm also wearing the wetsuit because we just talked about it, upwelling. It's been screaming south wind all day, so my theory is that the water temperature right near the shore has definitely dropped off a little bit. So we're gonna go see if that's true, but also catch a few waves from Tropical Storm Shantel. So let's do it.